7100 drvenih sanduka. 70 puta 35 cm. Broj 2135. Da li je umro od tifusa, od pribijanja, od gladi? Ko zna.
Naši ljudi umirali su u velikom broju usred gladi, zime i nečovečnog tretmana. Tako je, na primjer, srpskog narednika 8. rezervnog puka Milenka iz Babušnice ubio austrijski gardista jer je presporo izvršavao naredbe koje mu je davao austrijski stražar. Ovo se dogodilo 15. februara 1916. godine.
In 1914, Serbia was on the brink of collapse, its industries in shambles. 30,000 Serbian lives had been lost during the previous two Balkan wars. Plagued by political turmoil, the country was sliding inexorably towards civil war. Amid this crisis, a fervent Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austro-Hungary, triggering an instant response from Vienna. An ultimatum arrived at the Serbian capital.
The ultimatum reached Belgrade on July 25th, and it was clear, as British Minister of Foreign Affairs Edward Grey said, that it was the worst document one government had ever sent another. It left little room for manoeuvre. The Serbian government, or its members who happened to be in Belgrade, had to react quickly and accepted all Austro-Hungarian demands except the contentious points 5 and 6, which were incompatible with sovereignty as it was understood then and is understood now. Representatives of a foreign police force would carry out an investigation in Serbia.
After Belgrade rejected the monarchy's demands, both countries started mobilizing their troops. Fear of yet another war spread like wildfire among the weary Serbian army. Their only hope was Russia's promise to come to Serbia's aid in case of armed conflict. But on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia.
Serbia repelled the first attacks and pushed Austria back outside the Serbian border. That was a very unexpected defense move by the Serbian army, and Austria subsequently called up a large number of men. This mobilization was the spark for what was effectively a Balkan war.
This war was total war right from the start. The very first attacks by Austro-Hungarian troops were accompanied by murders of the civilian population, the burning of villages, and brutal treatment of prisoners of war. The Serbian High Command and government were bewildered by this approach. It was completely unexpected. It was assumed that the civilian population would be protected. Swiss criminologist Archibald Rees has estimated that 2,000 to 3,000 civilians were killed in that first August attack in Serbia, and around 4,000 were hauled off to camps. That was a new phenomenon the Serbian government was not expecting. One partial explanation is that the Austro-Hungarian troops were convinced by their superiors that there was a risk of a national insurgency among the population, and the general hatred of Serbs surfaced in the first fighting.
By the end of 1914, after pivotal battles at the rivers of Sur, Drina and Kolubara, the Austro-Hungarian army had been pushed back and would be kept outside Serbia's borders for another 8 months. While on the western and eastern fronts, the war escalated into a bloody inferno. There was a semblance of fleeting peace in Serbia.
The Russian army's war was a mix of big successes and catastrophic defeats, most notably at the Masurian Lakes, where 2 armies were destroyed and a large number of Russian prisoners of war ended up in Germany and Austro-Hungary.
Camps started being built in spring 1915. The first prisoners of war arrived during the summer. At Broumov, they were mainly Russian prisoners of war who helped build the POW camp.
News about prison camps and the influx of captives surfaced in the Viennese press.
Zwischen Krems und Merzdorf, wo die Baracken für die gefangenen Russen sich befinden werden, wird gegenwärtig fleißig gearbeitet. Da Braunau eines der größten Gefangenenlager Böhmens werden soll, sind umfassende Vorarbeiten notwendig. Wasserleitung, Kanäle, Spitalsanlagen usw. für vielleicht 100.000 Gefangene und die dazu nötige Bewachungsmannschaft erfordern intensive allseitige Sorge.
The POW camp stood on this site where the Broumov aerodrome is located today. The first buildings were the storerooms and command center. Buildings for the officers, mainly Russian POW officers, stood here. In the middle of the camp was a large building, the only building that wasn't timber, in fact. That was the bakery. Next to it were the showers, and a bit further on the hospital, with the POW cemetery at the end of the camp. The camp had 320 buildings. The hospital alone had 50 buildings, and around 10 buildings were isolation cells.
Camps were being set up all over the monarchy, some of the largest on Czech soil, in places with names no one had ever heard of, like Broumov or Jindrihovice.
In the background, we can see Jindrihovice and the Church of St. Martin. The camp, which consisted of 170 to 180 buildings, was spread over this entire area. In front of us is the Rotava basalt quarry, now flooded. The camp stretched from there all the way to the horizon over there. Built at a cost of roughly 7.5 million Austrian crowns, it was, to all intents and purposes, a town of 25 to 35,000 people. At times, it may have housed as many as 38,000 prisoners of war. It had its own guard towers, an electric fence around it, a bakery, laundries, a pharmacy.
Das Barackenlager wird immer mehr eine Stadt für sich und die Russen werden ihre Freude haben an dem schön gelegenen Erholungsheim, das wie ein Luftkurort anmutet mit einer herrlichen Rundsicht nach allen Richtungen.
The buildings mainly served as sleeping quarters. There were rows, not of beds even, but areas where the POWs slept, one right next to another. That was along the sides of the buildings, while in the center were bunks where POWs slept, again in 2 rows. So there were groups of 5,000 POWs, and each group had its own jail, its own medical surgery, and in each building there was a latrine.
Later, survivors would give accounts of the camp's inner workings and horrid living conditions to Dutch journalist Henri Aber. Shortly after the war, the freed soldiers were taken to neutral territory in Holland. It was there that Haber recorded and preserved their stories for posterity.
Zarobljenici su bili smešteni u barakama kao haringe u buretu. 200 i više osoba moralo je da spava u takvoj jednoj maloj baraci, zapravo oboru. O ćebadima, dušecima ili organima mogli smo samo da sanjamo. Nije ih bilo i svako je morao da spava na tvrdom patosu kako je znao i umeo.
Spavali smo u barakama na tvrdom, hladnom podu. Nije bilo niti jedne stolice, klupe ili stola. Kada bismo htjeli da obedujemo, morali smo da sednemo na pod ili da jedemo obrok stojeći.
The prisoners were forced to build their own barracks. They had to construct entire settlements with inadequate tools.
The POWs dug and constructed 12 kilometers of sewers. They built a water main from the upper end of Martinkovica. A well was dug. There was a tailor shop where uniforms were repaired and new clothes, gloves, shoes, caps were made. So the town, this POW camp, was practically self-sufficient. Compared to the town of Broumov, which had around 5,000 inhabitants at that time, this POW camp had 30,000.
One prison camp grew up in the vicinity of Carlsbad, the world-famous spa. This was the notorious camp of Jindrihovice.
To this day, we don't really know why Jindrihovice was chosen for the camp's location. The military apparatus evidently located this camp in the remote area, partly because of the German population, because at first Slavs were housed here, so it would be harder for them to escape and come into contact with the Czech population. There were no Czechs here.
As the war on the Eastern Front raged on, it reignited in the Balkans when the Central Powers, Austro-Hungary and Germany, allied with Bulgaria to finally overrun Serbia. Serbian prisoners of war were routinely executed or herded to prison camps far from their homes. By autumn 1915, the stream of prisoners from Serbia and Montenegro arriving at the prison camps of Broumov and Jindrihovice had overtaken the number of Russian captives.
Bekanntlich sollen, wie Wiener Blätter meldeten, 30.000 Mann Serben anstatt der Russen im Braunauer Barackenlager untergebracht werden. Pünktlich traf der Zug mit den Gefangenen ein, der von bosnischem Militär begleitet war.
The Serbian prisoners arrived at the camp in a demoralized state. They often had no shoes or trousers and wore rags in place of their uniforms. Their wretched condition epitomized the broken state of the Serbian army. Baffled by the Serbs' appearance, the Russian prisoners would doubt that these shadows of men had once been their comrades in arms.
A genuine flood of Serbian POWs arrived after the fall of Serbia in 1915. At that time, all deserters, or those who had become lost and were trying to get home, were usually captured by German, Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian forces. We know that tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 Serbian soldiers altogether were taken to Bulgarian, Austro-Hungarian and German camps. The Serbian authorities often regarded them as dead. They began to be known as propali, the vanished. They were not with their units, and nobody knew what had become of them.
Das anfängliche Neu-Moskau wurde bald zu einem Neu-Belgrad, seinerzeit im Höchststande weit über 20.000 Mann beherbergend.
The largest numbers of POWs arrived in 1915 and 1916, and it was in 1916 that the first diseases emerged in the camp due to overcrowding.
Odveli su me u Hajnisgrin, gdje sam proveo 4 meseca. U logoru se nalazilo 25 do 30.000 ljudi, a među njima oko 500-600 naših oficira. Stražari su nas tukli za svaku sitnicu ili su nas tretirali poput životinja. Ne zna se koliko puta su nas ubadali bajonetima. Ishrana je bila loša i nedovoljna, tako da smo gladovali. Mnogi naši su umrli od gladi i hladnoće jer nismo imali ni odeću ni obuću. Pred kraj smo dobijali namirnice od našeg Crvenog krsta. Bez te pomoći pomirili bi od gladi.
Resources were limited. The Austrian forces had not expected such a large influx. There were outbreaks of various diseases. There were problems with accommodation. So the situation as a whole was aggravated by the dramatic influx of Serbian POWs. In 1915, the Austro-Hungarian government tried to annihilate the Serbian elites. So a large number of Serbian professors, clergymen, and everyone who was seen as advocates of Serbian identity ended up in one of the internment camps.
A priest by the name of Lobodrag Jovanovic was captured and brought to Jindrihovice alongside the soldiers. Later, the church would publish his wartime reflections. A black cloud covered our land. In the darkness, a purple light emanated from the blood our martyrs had spilled. And the lifeless bodies of our fallen guardians seemed to be telling us, "Do not fear, there will be light, for without death there is no resurrection."
A large number of people were concentrated in the POW camps. This naturally led to suffering, diseases, and malnutrition because it was difficult to supply the camps during the war. The POWs usually received nothing more than beetroot broth or watery soup. Diseases like typhus and malaria started to appear.
Wer die verwahrlosten und durch die Strapazen des Krieges fast gebrochenen gefangenen Serben gesehen hat, erblickte in ihren Reihen gar manchen Todeskandidaten.
Even the hardened Viennese press was moved by the desolation at the Broumov prison camp. An emotional article described the deaths of 9 men during one cold day in January.
The issue of Serbian military and civilian internees in World War I is a marginal issue to this day. Throughout the 100 years from the end of World War I, they were completely ignored, and the crimes committed against them have never been atoned for. It seems that ever since the end of the war, they were not seen as part of the War of Emancipation image, which championed soldiers with rifles in their hands. If you look at any Serbian war memorial, there's usually a soldier holding a rifle high over his head. We have barely a handful of monuments to the civilians who suffered. There are precious few monuments reflecting on the role of civilians, let alone civilians who were interned. But just as the army legislation defines a POW as someone who was captured but continued to carry out his military duty, we can also regard a captured civilian as a citizen of the Kingdom of Serbia, even though he ended up in such unexpected and terrible conditions. And it's very sad that these people have remained shut out from the Serbian nation's collective consciousness for practically an entire century, despite their very profound suffering. These people have been unjustly forgotten, I think, almost completely erased from our general consciousness of World War I.
U Harizgrinu je život bio krajne težak. Hrana loša koliko se može zamisliti. Kriška hleba, vodenasta čorba, a nismo smeli ni da pisnemo ili bi sledilo zlostavljanje. Stražari su nas tukli i oduzimali nam hleb, koji je slao naš Crveni krst.
It wasn't just adults imprisoned in the camps. There were also hundreds of juveniles aged between 8 and 17. A school, complete with Serbian teacher, was even set up at the Broumov camp, to which eventually all children would be brought. Around 2,000 would remain in Broumov until the end of the war.
Why did the Austrians put old people in the camps when they knew they were of no use to the army? And above all, why children, who were just an extra complication? The Austrians would often clear out entire strategic areas and places where there was a risk of national uprising. And it's likely that they ordered the entire population to be evacuated, which meant entire families ended up in camps. It was only later that the Austrians realized how difficult it is to keep such diverse groups of people alive.
There was a dire lack of food not only inside the camp, but also in the surrounding villages. The starving children would sneak out of the camp whenever an opportunity arose, trying to scavenge anything they could get their hands on.
Co znám, je z vyprávění mého dědy a babičky. Tam byl tábor, to bylo velice krutý, jako nelidský. To mě říkala, že jsem zacházel nelidsky. A jednoho dne, tam, kde bydlela babička, viděla několik mladých kluků ze Srbska, že z vylejváku, kam se vylil odpad do kanalizace, jedli bramborové šlupky. Ona je litovala, tak jim dala hrnek bramborů vařených. Oni se nějak spřátelili a kolikrát se tam stavili. Vždycky jim dala trochu najíst, když ono toho habaději taky nebylo.
Martial law was declared in the entire zone around the POW camp. No contact with prisoners or access to the camp was permitted. The woman who gave Serbian boys food was supposed to have reported them, but instead she helped them, risking her own life.
The woman who risked her life to help the famished Serbian boys was 27-year-old Matilda Hartmanova from the village of Martinkovice.
To byli mladí kluci a jí na památku dali prsten, vyrobený je ručně, takový šedivý, a vevnitř byl vyražený rok 1915. A na vrchu byl přidělaný kámen v červené barvě, bylo tam 5 puntíků. A těch 5 puntíků značilo, že bylo těch kluků 5. A když pak odjížděli po likvidaci toho tábora, ty babičce psali vždycky nějaký pozdrav na Vánoce.
Whereas all children were brought to Broumov, adults were sent to various camps, scattered across the Austro-Hungarian and German lands.
U svim logorima je bilo loše, ali najgori je bio Braunau. Osim loše hrane, još su nas i stražari tukli kao zveri.
Mađarski narednik izbio je bajonetom jednog čovjeka koji se usudio da neposredno pre nego što izađe napolje zapali cigaretu u prolazu. Iako je krivcu ruka teško povređena, a usled gubitka krvi je bio malaksao, niko ni na trenutak nije pomislio da ga pošalje u bolnicu.
There are no documented cases of torture or killing of prisoners like we know from World War II, but there are reports of certain cruel treatment. It was mainly Hungarian soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army who were the cruelest.
U Braunau su nas ponekad danima ostavljali bez ikakve hrane. Ako bismo se usudili da tražimo hleb, u barake bi došli nemački i mađarski vojnici, naoružani velikim motkama, i pretukli bi nas, kao da su bili divlje zveri. Mnogi moji drugovi su izdahnuli nakon što su bili tako neljudski isprebijeni.
Stražari su se ophodili neljudski prema nama. Smatrali su nas tovarnim životinjama i bez milosti su nas tukli za najmanji prestup. Mnogi naši vojnici su umirali od zadobijenih rana ili su ostali bogalji. Mađarski stražari su me kundacima tukli po glavi, leđima i rukama, jer sam rekao da nismo pobeđeni i da je naš kralj još uvijek na čelu svoje vojske. Od posljedice tih udaraca desna ruka mi je trajno neupotrebljiva.
The POWs mainly worked on farms in the district. They also worked in the local brickworks, lime kiln, and other factories. They worked on the regulation of the river Stjanava, or turned forest tracks into roads, because they were used for any work. They built a water main in Martinkovice, for example. They also worked inside the camp, where workshops were set up. They made reed shoes for the guards. There was a carpentry shop, a forge. The camp was basically a self-sufficient town.
In Jindrihovice, the prisoners were forced to build the Sokolov chemical plant, along with its entire railway network.
It's an interesting fact that part of this bridge we see here was dismantled in Serbia as the Austrian army's war booty and brought here. Here it was reassembled, and it's still here to this day. It's roughly the central part. According to some reports, when they were building the chemical plant, the Jindrihovice POWs walked there and back every day. That's roughly 23 kilometers in each direction. But I personally think that wasn't true, because the Austrian war industry could not afford to let the POWs get so exhausted if they worked in the chemicals plant. So we think, and there are some photographs that might document this, that the Jindrihovice POWs had some accommodation facility here at the Sokolov plant.
Stražari su zarobljenike prisiljavali da peške prelaze beskrajne razdaljine, a pljuštili su i udarci kundakom i bičem, a da nije bilo nikakvog objašnjivog povoda. Okrutnost stražara nije zaobišla čak ni ranjenike. Stalno su ih podvrgavali kazni na stubu, trajala je 4 sata i to pooštro kod noći na 8 i 10 stepeni. Koliko sam ih samo video obeznanjenih na tom kobnom stubu.
We don't have much information about the lives of prisoners in that camp. We can document their work, when they got up, what they had to eat, where they were put to work in the vicinity, the Rotova basalt quarry, the Sokolov chemical plant, harvest work on farms in the area, but it's very hard to document the actual life in the camp because we practically have just one memory of one of the Serbian POWs who recalls how he swapped the socks he'd been sent from home for food in the kitchen.
The camp physician at Broumov had a passion for amateur photography. Dr. Georg Langer used every opportunity to capture life inside the camp. He gifted an album with 200 photographs to camp commander General Mayhofer, who fortunately preserved this historical record.
He took pictures of things that interested him as a doctor or as an amateur photographer. So we have surviving portraits of POWs, scenes from daily life, their work, being issued with food, resting. He had a specific sense of humor, so when he took a picture of a POW resting on the ground, he called him a drunken layabout. When he took a picture of POWs sharing some bread, he added the comment, "Joy shared is doubled, but a piece of bread shared is always just half."
Philosopher, On the sunny side. Morning ablutions. Take it easy, Mirko. Things will be different in 100 years. There's a hare. Draga. Draga at a concert. She was one of only a few women in the camp, and the only one whose fleeting image appears in more than one of Langer's pictures. Draga had followed her captive father all the way from Serbia and volunteered as a camp nurse in order to remain near him. Draga tended to all those in need. Both prisoners and guards held her in high esteem.
Am 11. des Monats kamen abermals neue Gefangenentransporte von Serben, im Ganzen 6000 Mann. Wie ihre früher schon eingelieferten Kameraden boten auch diese Serben das Bild größter Verwahrlosung.
Tokom transporta kroz Srbiju zarobljenici nisu dobili ništa da jedu. Presamićeni od gladi, ulazili bi ponekad u seoske kuće i molili za malo hleba. Ali nemački vojnici išli su za njima, tukli ih kundacima i otimali im hranu iz ruku. Da bi utolili očajničku glad, jeli su sirovo meso mrtvih životinja koje su ležale kraj puta, inače ne bi ostali u životu.
Dem Publikum ist es streng verboten, sich an Gefangene irgend heranzudrängen, sie anzusprechen oder dergleichen. Jeder Verkehr führt in solchen Fällen nicht selten zu langwierigen Unannehmlichkeiten und strenger Bestrafung.
In the predominantly German town of Broumov, there was a Czech family, the Linharts, originally from Police nad Metui. Josef Linhart had a tailor shop in Broumov, and in 1915 he was called up to the Austro-Hungarian army.
Moje matka se narodila jako nejmladší ze 3 dcer v Broumově rodičům Josefovi Linhartovi a matce Kláře. Bohužel tahle idyla skončila první světovou válkou, kdy byl povolán do armády. Dostal se na srbskou frontu, kdy v roce 1915 v říjnu při rakousko-uherské ofenzívě u Staré Pazové padl.
The start of October brought a major offensive from 2 sides that was devastating for the Serbs. Certain locations were systematically bombarded, with the Austro-Hungarian and German air forces marking the targets. These were new phenomena. The amphibious assault began at around 5 in the morning on October 7th. German units attacked Banova Brdo and crossed the river Sava. Austro-Hungarian units were supposed to attack the central part of Belgrade because they wanted to take the biggest symbol of Belgrade, the fortress. But not everything went according to plan. The first wave of the attack was repelled, with the attackers killed or taken prisoner. And we have testimony of how Serbian soldiers proudly led Austro-Hungarian prisoners through the streets of Belgrade. Around 1,100 Austro-Hungarian soldiers died during 3 days of fighting.
It is assumed that the tailor Josef Linhart was also killed during the battles of Bloody October. The widow he left behind was named Klara.
Ten okamžik byla válečná vdova sama na 3 děti a bylo nutné získat nějaké zaměstnání, nějakou obživu. Nevím teda, jestli to bylo jako válečná vdova, získala ve vznikajícím táboře práci, anebo prostě se tam přihlásila na práci jako kuchařka.
Despite having lost her husband at the hands of the Serbs, Klara cooked for the Serbian captives in order to provide for her children. Day after day, she prepared the same thin beetroot soup with dumplings made out of little other than flour and water.
Za jelo je bilo obezbijeđeno ujutru litar cigure, popodne porcija šećerne repe ili kupusa. Uveče porcija čorbe od brašna, vjerovatno žirovog.
The food was never more than meager. Hunger drained the men's spirits. But despite the circumstances, some of the prisoners befriended Klara and her children.
Z vyprávění mé matky vím, že se spřátelili s některými zajatci a nejvíce vzpomíná na jednoho zajatce, který se jmenoval Milja. Kamarádila se s tím Miljou a ten jí vždycky říkával, ty jsi takový malý magarac. Což mi vysvětlila, že se jedná, ty jsi takový malý oslík. A na to ráda vzpomínala.
We don't know much about Milja, only that he was a school teacher who survived captivity. Perhaps because of Clara.
Dokonce Milja po válce zaslal pohlednici, kde jako pozdravuje milou babičku Kláru a je tady na tomto snímku uvedený, jako kde je.
Clara worked in the camp practically for the entire war. She left a unique legacy of photographs from inside the camp, and in particular, interesting photographs of Serbian POWs in theatre costumes.
At first, the American Christian organization, the YMCA, looked after the POWs. An American called McPherson came here and worked here till 1917, when the United States joined the war, and he taught the POWs all kinds of things. For example, he brought them books, spectacles. He taught them to read and write because many of them were illiterate. He even taught them to play football and brought them musical instruments and taught them to play them, taught them how to grow vegetables and so on.
In Großdorf bei Braunau erkrankte eine hiesige Person sowie 11 serbischen Kriegsgefangenen in Braunau mit Flecktyphus. Dem Epidemieausbruch zur Folge haben die Behörden eine vollständige Isolation des Barackenlagers in dem Sinne angeordnet, dass der ganzen Wachtruppe bis auf weiteres jegliches Kontakt mit den Zivilpersonen verboten wurde.
Zarobljenici su spavali na slamaricama, koje su menjane samo jednom u 6 meseci i koje su bile leglo gamadi, prostorije koje su bile predviđene za odmaranje vojnika, a gde je vrvelo od buva i vašaka, bilo je apsolutno nemoguće provediti kako treba.
Dirt, fleas and lice were the main culprits in outbreaks of typhoid fever. Even with all efforts to maintain hygiene, deadly epidemics kept spreading.
The first records of deaths are from 1916, but the biggest numbers of deaths are in 1917 and 1918, the last 2 years of the war, when the food supply was minimal and there was hardly any medicine. And not just for the prisoners of war, but the civilian population in the vicinity as well. There were practically no medicines for the POWs, and the biggest problem was the typhus epidemic that broke out in 1917, when apparently 40 people died every day. Almost every day there were funeral processions from the camp to the cemetery here, where POWs were buried either in single or mass graves. Local civilians from Jindrihovice would always take part in this ceremony. Even the local Catholic priest took part, mainly to accompany Italians on their final journey. So this was a kind of funeral ceremony that used to take place practically every day towards the end of the war.
Among those buried in the camp cemetery is Blagoj Shuchorovic from the village of Slivovice. He had a brother, Lubomir, and a cousin, Velimir, neither of whom survived the war.
Za Ljubomira znamo podatke da je zarobljen pred kraj 915. godine i odveden u logor Braunau. Tu je umro 1. juna 1916. godine.
The camps were much too big, badly supplied with a large mass of people in one place for a long time. They were places of great suffering and, above all, infectious diseases.
The Shuchorovic family got word that Lubomir had perished in Broumov, but they knew nothing of the terrible conditions of the camp.
Zatvorenih nesretnih, koliko mene popa. A jo, me veselih, daj mi malo. Ne. A joj, ne. Pregleda ga neko. Joj, kaki je nesretnik. Joj, prijatelj, obalanci. Pa tako su i otišli, ne. Ljudi, životinju ne muči pošto čovjek čoveka. Pa svi smo od krvi i mesa. Svi. I da muči toliko zverstvo da vide da muči jedan drugoga. Pa i njega je neko rodio koji njega. I njega je majka gajila.
As Serbian custom dictates, Lubomir's great-grandson would put up a roadside monument to honor his ancestor.
Koji je ručno isklesan, veliki kamen, gdje je naveo da je Šušurović Ljubomir iz Štovice godine 1915. pao u ropstvo Austrijanaca i umro je 1. juna 1916. u češkom Braunau, u 37. godini života. Da spomen podiže otac Jevrem, brat Vladimir i Ljubomirov sin Ostoja, koji je rođen 1913. Ljubomir ga je samo jedan put video i otišao je u rat. Velimir i Blagoje su također zarobljeni. Za Velimira imamo neki podatak da je umro u logoru u Mađarskoj.
Ovdje bio jedan komšija sa njim, isto. On je umro od gladi. Pričao mi on 21. godini, on kaže, mi smo kroz žicu, dokle smo dovatili travu pojeli. A ovaj je imao neki zlatan sat i prodao, te malo mu donosilo zato, te je ostao živ.
Blagoje's bereaved family never learned of his fate.
Za Blagoja njemu se izgubio trag sa početka rata. Da li umro, da li je poginuo, gdje je sahranjen, ne znam se kako. Čak u žrtvama Velikog rata stoji da je Blagoje umro u izrobljeništvu. Znak pitanja.
Today we are able to fill in the blanks. Private Blagoj Šušurović died in Jindrihovice on January 9th, 1918. He was just 32 years old.
To niko nije našao, niti je ko to tada tražio. Ja se zahvaljujem da se zna gdje je taj nastradao od naših predaka i gdje je ostao.
Two and a half thousand POWs, most of them Serbs, died in the Broumov camp.
Von den ausgehungerten und durch Kriegsstrapazen völlig entkräfteten serbischen Todeskandidaten sterben fast täglich mehrere.
The most common cause of death was listed as consumption. On the 16th of January 1916, another 20 Serbs were buried.
There were major epidemics, mainly typhus, with as many as 100 people dying per month in Broumov.
In practically all prisoner-of-war camps, whether they were run by the Central Powers or the Allies, 10 to 12% of all POWs died. There were some 30 to 40,000 people in Jindrihovice, which is more or less in line with the 10% casualty rate. Most of them died from illnesses, of course, and towards the end of the war from malnutrition, because as the end of the war approached, the conditions got even worse, and what's more, the climate wasn't ideal. Even the Russian POWs called it Siberia, because the conditions here, especially in autumn and winter, were miserable, even for them.
Nisu nam davali odeću i obuću i većina nas je hodala u dronjcima i bosih nogu. Zima je bila izuzetno oštra. U svakoj baraci bile su 2 peći koje su retko potpaljivane. Koliko je strašno hladno bilo, može se zaključiti kad se pomisli da su barake bile ogromne i od drveta, a vetar je zavijao kroz prorede dasaka, tako da smo se cijele noći smrzavali i nismo mogli da spavamo.
Dosta ih je umiralo od gladi, zimi od hladnoće, od tifusa, od bolesti, a morali su da rade teške poslove. Sve su to bili mladi vojnici, većinom do 25 godina. U to vreme nisu uspevali da prave i sanduke, nego su ih nosili u tim sanducima i tamo isipavali u grobljima. Često se dešavalo da su ovi koji su nosili sanduke sa svojim drugovima, sutradan su sami bili u tim sanducima sahranjivani. Suvišno je mladih života odneseno, otišlo. Večna im pamet.
Serbian historiography often stresses that civilians were taken off to camps as genocide to annihilate the Serbs as a nation, but the situation is much more complicated. We can see that although there were mass deaths in the camps, it was often not deliberately planned. The occupying administration simply wasn't prepared for the situation. As the Austro-Hungarian representatives said to Serbian prisoners of war, "We are blockaded by the Allies," meaning there was not enough food in Austro-Hungary. And now we are blockading you. That means that the ones who suffered the most were the prisoners of war and not Austrian citizens.
Over there is the entrance gate to the cemetery, where over 2,500 POWs, and probably some guards as well, are buried. The POWs built this memorial in 1915, when more and more started dying. In fact, it's the last trace of the camp because nothing else remains of it.
These areas were the cemetery of the Jindrihovice prisoner of war camp. Over there is the old part of the cemetery, Alter Friedhof, or the Orthodox part, where they started burying Serbs and Russians in 1915 and 1916. And then, when there were Italians as well, the cemetery was gradually enlarged with this new part. Behind me, you can see a Catholic cross, so this is the Catholic part where Italian POWs were buried. In total, 2,465 Serbs and Montenegrins, 56 Russians, and 1,301 Italians died in the camp. So the total number of victims of the Jindrihovice camp buried in this cemetery is 3,855.
1918, the final year of the Great War, brought a number of heavy offensives on various battlefronts. Drained of its lifeblood, Europe's economy was in a state of collapse. Yet people could feel that the war was nearing its end.
Auflösung von Kriegsgefangenenlagern. In der nächsten Zeit werden die Kriegsgefangenenlager Millowitz und Heinrichsgrün im Erzgebirge in der Folge durch die Lager Eger und Braunau aufgelöst werden.
Only 2 weeks after this newspaper article, on November 11th, 1918, World War I was over. The deadliest conflict in human history to date had claimed nearly 10 million lives. Millions more were missing. Serbia alone had lost a third of its entire population, almost half its men. But for many of the prisoners of war, the suffering was far from over.
In dem Spital des hiesigen Kriegsgefangenenlagers befand sich eine größere Anzahl von schwerkranken Soldaten. Es herrschte die Lust, diese bei der Schließung des Lagers zu vergessen. Die Pflegerinnen sind meist abgereist und die armen Schwerkranken, die ihre Gesundheit auf dem Altar ihres Vaterlandes geopfert haben, wurden ihrem Schicksal überlassen.
We are now at the oldest building, the only surviving building of the Jindrihovice camp. Dating from 1917, it was originally a water reservoir for the camp. After the war ended, it was designated in the mid-1920s as one of 3 mausoleums for fallen soldiers from countries in the new state of Yugoslavia.
During the late 1920s, at the request of the Yugoslav government, the new Czechoslovak army disinterred the dead Serbian prisoners from cemeteries throughout Bohemia. Their remains were relocated to what would become the mausoleum of Jindrihovice.
Ovdje vidite u ovim malim sanducima su smešteni ostaci srpskih i ruskih vojnika, 7100 srpskih i 189 ruskih vojnika koji su stradali u austrijskim logorima i onda su posle rata ekshumirani i preneseni ovdje u kripti.
That makes a total of around 7,300 remains, which makes this area, or this mausoleum, the biggest World War I burial ground in the territory of today's Czech Republic.
The mausoleum was inaugurated in 1932. The Serbian king, Alexander, ordered cypress trees to be brought from the Hilander monastery on Mount Athos and planted around the memorial. Though located in the Czech Republic, it is considered territory of the Republic of Serbia. It is the second largest Serbian cemetery in the world.
There are even 88 small coffins from Holland containing Serbian prisoners of war who died here in 1919.
In 1938, their remains were also transferred back to Jindrihovice. At the German border, the guards halted the convoy of coffins. The Wehrmacht soldiers paid their tributes with resounding gun salutes and a funeral march. Just 3 months later, these same German troops would invade and occupy the Czech Sudetenland, and with it, Jindrihovice. But that is a whole other chapter.
Mladi bi trebali da pamte da su se njihovi preci borili za slobodu, da su se žrtvovali za Srbiju koja nije stvarana tako lako i jednostavno i da čuvaju to što su nam preci ostavili.
After the war, Milja returned to Serbia and continued working as a teacher. The cook, Klara Lindhardt, mother of 3, married a merchant named Karel Valenta, who had 5 children of his own. Matilda Hatmanova, who had helped the starving Serbian boys, survived both world wars and lived in good health to the age of 80. Camp physician Georg Langer made his way to Vienna, whereafter his trace disappears from the military archives. The Serbian priest, Lubodrag Jovanovic, continued to serve his church. 10 years after returning home, he wrote down his most haunting recollection. It was the memory of a 12-year-old boy calling him over to his deathbed. I stepped closer and stroked his hair. On the bed above his head, I noticed 3 letters. TBC, temperature 39.9. What can I do for you, Milivoje? I would like to ask you something, Father, because I can feel I'll be dead within the hour, he replied. I want to wear a Serbian soldier's cap on my head when I die. All right, I'll get you a soldier's cap, not for you to die in, but to wear when you get back on your feet. Little Milivoje thanked me and said, "You know, Father, when someone dies in here, the medics grab all his possessions. Please don't let anyone take my cap." I want to be buried wearing it. As a Serbian soldier. Why do you want that? Because I'm sure, Father, one day the good Lord will look into my grave, and when he sees how small I am, he will punish our enemies for separating me from my mother. Milivoje went quiet. After a while, he gathered his last strength and said, "I die with faith in God, who will punish our enemies." Little Milivoje exhaled, and his life ended.